a mixed-race child. She and Fred ended up getting married on November 17th in Ledbury. They eventually moved to Coatbridge, where Fred took on work as an ice cream van driver. Rena's daughter, Charmaine, was born in March of 1963, and they gave a number of different reasons to explain Charmaine's mixed ancestry, with the most common being that Rena had suffered a miscarriage, and because of this, they had decided to adopt a child. So there's already a lot of deceit going on in Fred's life at this point, as well as his deviant sexual behavior. Fred and his family ended up relocating to the Savoy Street, Bridgeton district of Glasgow, and in July of 1964, Rena gave birth to a daughter named Anne-Marie. It was Fred's first biological child. Around this time, Fred and Rena were able to hire a nanny, Isa McNeil, who said that although Rena was a considerate mother, she struggled to raise the two girls, and that Fred treated the two girls awfully. He had constructed a cage on the bottom bunk of a bunk bed, and they were only allowed out of their cage when Fred was away at work. During this period of time, a young woman named Anne McFall came into the West sphere, and eventually she and Fred would begin a relationship. Fred is known to have engaged in a number of extramarital affairs during this period of time, and it was because of these that Rena began an affair of her own with a man by the name of John McLaughlin. One story that's been bandied about is that at one point Fred walked in on Rena McLaughlin and he began to beat Rena, which prompted McLaughlin to hit Fred, after which Fred drew a knife and grazed McLaughlin's abdomen. When McLaughlin hit Fred a second time, he stopped defending himself. John McLaughlin later stated that Fred had no problem hitting a woman, but if a man stood up to him, he would back down and cower like a dog. And this happened on numerous occasions. Every time that McLaughlin would find a new bruise on Rena, he would go and beat Fred. Another story from this period of time comes from McLaughlin, who stated that at one point when Charmaine was a toddler, she asked Fred for an ice cream from his truck, and in response, Fred cuffed her about the head until McLaughlin stepped in and began to beat Fred. So it seems like, there's this whole Jerry Springer dichotomy going on in Fred and Rena's marriage, with this guy McLaughlin being involved, and Fred is beating his wife and children. McLaughlin is beating Fred. On November 4th of 1965, Fred accidentally ran over and killed a boy in Glasgow with his ice cream truck, and he was eventually cleared of any wrongdoing by police. Fearing the reaction he would receive from the people of Glasgow, however, Fred took Charmaine and Anne-Marie and returned to Gloucester, where he rented a small caravan at the Timberland Caravan Park in Bishop's Cleeve. Rena joined not long after in February of 1966, accompanied by Isa McNeil and Anne McFall. Not long after they were all reunited, Fred found a job driving a truck for a local slaughterhouse. Around this period of time, Fred began to exert his dominance over McNeil, McFall, as well as Rena, and would beat the women on multiple occasions. It's also been speculated that around this time, he began to sexually abuse Charmaine, while at the same time encouraging Rena to return to prostitution in order to help the family's financial situation. While all of this was going on, Fred was unaware that Raina had been in contact with her old boyfriend, McLaughlin, asking him to help rescue her, the two older women, as well as her children, and they set a plan into motion, wherein McNeil's boyfriend, John Trotter, would come to Bishop Cleeve to take all of them away. Unbeknownst to the others, however, Anne McFall had become infatuated with Fred, and as I stated earlier, they had begun a relationship, and Fred is supposed to have told her numerous times that he would marry her, and Anne McFall ended up ratting the other women out to Fred. On the day of the planned escape, Fred arrived and was said to be oddly calm, as he stated that he and Anne McFall would be staying there with children and that the others could go. A fight ensued during which Fred was struck a number of times. Eventually, the police became involved, and Rena, Isa, and the two women's boyfriends were allowed to leave. Fred is supposed to have told Raina that if he ever saw her again, he would kill her. Now, Raina attempted to remain in contact with her daughters, returning often to visit them, and although she was friendly with Anne McFall at first, she soon began to resent the younger woman, and it makes you wonder if she wasn't suffering from some sort of battered woman syndrome, because she knew that Fred was a dangerous individual, yet despite this, she kept going back into the situation. Eventually, Raina ended up stealing some items from Fred and going home, at which point she was arrested and was returned to Gloucester to face trial. She was sentenced to 3 years of probation. During the trial, Fred testified, and he admitted that he and McFall were living together, but he falsely claimed that McFall would be going back to Scotland in the not-too-distant future. McFall ended up moving into her own caravan at Bishop's Cleeve, as Rena split her time between living with Fred and going back to Glasgow. Letters have been found from this time in which Anne McFall states that she really believes that she will have a better life should Fred divorce his wife and instead marry her. And it was obvious that she was completely head over heels in love with him despite his violent, domineering personality. And because of all of this, Anna would attempt to persuade Fred on numerous occasions to divorce Raina Costello. In late 1966 or early 1967, Anne McFall became pregnant with Fred West's child, and in July of 1967, she vanished without a trace. Unsurprisingly, given the life that she was living, as well as the times, Anne McFall was never reported missing. Fred first met Rosemary Letts in 1969, shortly after Rosemary turned 15. Rosemary came from a troubled background. She was born on November 29th of 1953 to Bill Letts and Daisy Fuller. She was the fifth of 7 children, and it's said that her mother suffered from depression during the pregnancy and underwent electroshock therapy because of this depression, with some speculating that this may have caused some unknown injuries to the unborn fetus. Rose was said to be a moody and precocious child, and she was prone to daydreaming and performed poorly at school. When she was a teenager, her parents separated, and she went to live with her mother before moving back in with her father at the age of 16 in Bishop's Cleeve. Bill Letts was said to be a violent schizophrenic who would repeatedly abuse his daughters both sexually and physically. And this, I'm sure, played a large part in Rose's adolescence, as it's been said that she was fascinated by her body once she reached puberty and would parade around the house naked or semi-naked in front of her younger brother. At the age of 13, Rose began sneaking into her brother's room at night, where she sexually molested him, as well as her other brother, Gordon. When she met Fred West in 1969, West was 27 years old, and Fred seemed to become infatuated with Rose from the instant they met at a bus stop, and she has said that she initially was repulsed by him and suspected he was probably a homeless man. Eventually, this repulsion turned to flattery at the attention Fred gave her, and she turned him down on a number of occasions for a date, but would allow him to accompany her home. Fred learned that Rose worked at a local bakery, and he convinced a uninterested third party to go into the bakery and give Rose a gift, saying that it was from a man outside. And shortly after this, Fred entered the bakery and asked Rose to go on a date with him, which she accepted. Now, initially, Rose treated Fred's daughters kindly, as she saw that both of them were severely neglected. She eventually became Fred's full-time nanny. She and Fred worked out a deal wherein he would give her enough money to give to her parents to convince them that she was still working at the bakery. Eventually, Rose introduced Fred to her parents, and purportedly they both disliked him immensely upon first meeting, with Bill Letts threatening to call social services on Fred if he continued to see his daughter. Rose's parents forbid her from seeing Fred, which she obviously ignored, and eventually her parents went to social services and informed them that Fred was having a sexual relationship with their daughter and had begun prostituting her out of his caravan. So Rose was taken from her family home and put into an approved school where she was not allowed out without proper authorization. And the few times that she was allowed to leave the school, she would go and visit Fred, despite being warned that these excursions were only to go visit her family. Rose was released from the approved school on her 16th birthday, during which time Fred was serving a 30-day jail sentence for stealing and unpaid fines. And he had moved out of the caravan park at this point. Social services had become involved and taken his daughters. And when Fred got out of jail, Rose immediately moved in with him. And not long after, they retrieved Charmaine and Anne-Marie from the social services. Rose's father made one final attempt to remove Fred from their lives by again contacting the police. Rose was examined by a doctor who found that she was pregnant, and once more Rose was placed into a care home. Eventually, Rose was released with the understanding that she never see Fred again and that she terminate the pregnancy. Instead, Rose went to live with Fred, and because of this, Rose's father forbid her from ever coming into the house again. A few months after this, they moved into a house in Midland Road, Gloucestershire. On October 17, 1970, Rose gave birth to the couple's first child, a daughter they named Heather Ann. And there is some speculation that Heather may have in fact been the biological daughter of Rose's own father. Now, Charmaine and Anne-Marie had already been instructed that they were to refer to Rose as their mother. And by the time that Rose had turned 17, Fred was in jail once more, serving a 6.5-month sentence for stealing. And it's important to note here that Rose's demeanor towards the girls had changed considerably from what it had once been, with Anne Marie stating that, well, she